Hi, everybody. Welcome to INE Live. I'm your host, Catherine Brown, and today we're tackling governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC. And I promise it's going to be fun, believe it or not. We're talking about how to get your enterprise checking all the boxes in the most secure, efficient, and cost-effective ways possible. And we have a panel of experts to lead you through some of the biggest challenges and talk through some really innovative solutions. We're also conducting a live poll right now. You can head on over to info.ine.com/GRC. That's info.ine.com/GRC. We'll put it on the screen for you to take part in the poll. You can drop your answers in and also register to see the results, getting insights into industry trends as it relates to GRC and cybersecurity, and in particular in the areas of experience, confidence, and automation. So be sure and do that. We'll be putting that website address on the screen for you during this live stream, so you can head over there at any point. First, as we do each time we stream here on INE Live, want to let you know we are, of course, streaming live right now across social media platforms, including LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. Be sure to like and subscribe on the social media platform you're using so you can always stay in the loop when we're live. We want you to get involved, talk to us, talk to others. We see you getting involved in our chat right now. We love to see that. Our team is monitoring chat, so if you have a comment, go ahead and drop it in. If you have a question, do us a favor, put a Q at the beginning so we can find those easily. And the links to those polls, I'm just noticing, are in all of the chat threads as well, so you can click on that as well. We'll get to as many questions and comments as we can today. With that, I will bring in our guests, starting with Igor Volovich. Igor is an award-winning cybersecurity executive, currently Vice President of Compliance Strategy at Qmulos. Igor has led and advised some of the largest commercial and public sector enterprise security programs. He's a frequent speaker, host of the Compliance Therapy podcast, and co-author of the upcoming security leadership book, Dear CISO, Notes from the Battlefield. Igor, so glad to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Jack Reedy also here today. Jack is INE's Director of Cybersecurity Content, no stranger on INE Live. He has more than 14 years experience in global enterprise operations across blue, purple, and red team functionalities. Jack's experience in cybersecurity spans a variety of industries from defense, entertainment, to technology, making his insights particularly valuable and his awareness of cybersecurity solutions applicable to a wide array of challenges. It's going to be a fun stream here today. Jack, Igor, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right, we are going to kick it off with the P word. All right, forgive me, right? The pandemic. It's been called the single greatest agent of digital transformation, driving rapid adoption of cloud and telework worldwide. I mean, it changed the way that everyone did business. And along the way, many enterprises really found themselves unprepared, right? Or at least underprepared for this huge disruption of the traditional work models, with security often taking a back seat, right, to ensuring continued business operations and sustained productivity. So I'm curious, and Igor, we'll start with you here, and Jack, I'd love to hear from you as well. The kinds of challenges in particular that you face as a security and business leader during these times, as we're trying to get security back up there to the forefront while also repositioning the way that everyone does business.
Well, you're absolutely right with the repositioning start. I think that's a good launching point for this conversation. So we tend to view security as kind of an adjunct function, or even if it's a core function, it's still considered to be a separate, segregated function. So it's, and as long as we continue to treat security as a separate function that stands on its own, it will never really be truly integrated, and it will never really become an integral part of the business. And I think that's something that we're seeing the trend, at least certainly in leadership circles that I try to insert myself into. The conversation that I try to foster is really about integrating security, making it a dimension of each business function, not so much a standalone function. And we've seen, kind of a standalone function of security being there for a long time. Folks have sort of accepted it. You have the CISO function. That's a separate team. You've got a compliance functions. That's a separate team. You've got audit. You've got risk management. You've got assessment. You've got all these different functions. Ultimately, the objective is to manage risk, right? How we do it, what we're doing, the tools, the techniques, the procedures, the policies. All of that is really important. But these are kind of the how and the what. The real why, right? If we start with why, as Simon Sinek says, we really want to go back to what we're trying to do. We're trying to protect the business. We're trying to ensure a resilient business operation. We're trying to ensure continuity. And really, in the end, we're protecting the value chain, right? How do we generate the value in the business? And it doesn't really matter what kind of mission you're in. If you're in government, of course, we're not really generating profits. If you're working for a nonprofit, of course, you're not generating profits. But really, ultimately, focusing on what the mission is, understanding what the mission is, and then figuring out how to protect it, that's really an objective. research shows that the best way to do it, and certainly the emerging trend that we're seeing from analyst firms, they're definitely talking about this idea of really distributing security decisions and ensuring accountability at the level of actual business function. So embedding security in, that's really the true answer, I think. And what we've seen during the pandemic, to go back to the original question, folks really focused on, well, let's just get operations up. Let's make sure that we can support the new use cases or the new work models. Everybody's going home, so let's go ahead and push out these solutions to the endpoint. And folks kind of forgot about how to do traditional security, let's say, right? Figuring out, what it actually takes to protect the business. We focused on the use case individually. We tried to make sure, okay, we can get people back to work. And now that there's kind of that shift back to more of a kind of traditional work model, maybe there's a lot of hybrid work models in place still continuing. A lot of folks never are going back to the office. So we kind of have to play both ends of that spectrum. On the one hand, we still have to protect the traditional resilient enterprise. On the other hand, here's all these folks that went home and not going back. So we kind of have to rethink. So you said reposition. I really want to put a big pin in that, right? Repositioning, and it really starts with shifting the mindset, right? How do we think about security? Is it really kind of an adjunct add-on function, or do we really embed it in? And so we have to stop thinking about kind of, we're in this pandemic mode. We're post-pandemic now, right? We're living in the post-pandemic world. And so let's get back to basics. Let's ensure cyber hygiene. Let's make sure we understand what that attack surface looks like. Let's understand the threat models as they apply to our business. And regardless of what work model we find ourselves in, principles apply, right? Just because we went home doesn't mean security went away, right? Or it has to be haphazard. It has to be slapped on, as an afterthought, right? Same principles apply. You still have to do the basics. You have to understand what kind of the foundational principles of your program are. And you also have to have good measurement. How do you understand if you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing and if it's working, right? And we'll talk about that, I think, more in the conversation. So over to Jack.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that there was almost a 49 gold mine rush to the cloud, if you will, where everybody was just laying claim to what they could from a business operations standpoint. But with that, traditional security comes with a lot of technical controls already built in, and a lot of the processes are on the rails. When we rushed into this new technology and started creating these, forefronts for our business, I feel like a lot of the normal technical controls that you would have from a business standpoint were kind of left behind. So you have developers that are just kind of doing stuff with admin tokens and access and all sorts of, issues with authentication identity. I can't tell you how many different, incidents I ran where somebody put shared keys up in a GitHub repository. Right. So I think right now where we're at is we went from, okay, let's get operational, and we're kind of having to walk backwards into, okay, now it's time to really implement and tie down these technical controls to something that we can still enable business through allowing the developers to create, but they don't necessarily have access to our master billing account, and or just because they can create doesn't necessarily mean they need access to all these data pools, or being able to share these accounts out to the entire world, things like that, which luckily AWS has adjusted it for that. That's not the default anymore, right? But still, it's one of those things where we have to go back and now audit what we've created in the meantime, just to make sure that the controls are being applied appropriately, and we're still enabling business functions as we're slowly tightening down. I don't think in the cloud environment, the scream test is going to pass muster. You know what I mean? Like, you can't just shut stuff off.
Right. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think the idea that we kind of, went out there and pushed into the cloud, everybody, like you said, it was the crazy 49ers rush to the cloud. And that's exactly what happened. We saw it in government. We saw it in commercial. We saw it everywhere, right? Defense, certainly, right? I mean, to a lesser extent, we still have folks who are operating at like 95% on-prem environments, but they have to, right? So we get that. Some folks are still living the skiff life. I mean, that's never gone away. And especially here in the Beltway, that's, a lot of people who live the skiff life. And for folks who don't know that term, it's a secure compartmented information facility. You're living in a bunker, basically. Your phone goes into a locker, your laptop goes into a locker, you bring nothing in with you, you carry nothing out. It's kind of the campsite rule, leave the way you found it. And so you have to actually, our company actually found out the hard way that it's difficult to create the kind of talent, get the kind of talent, keep the kind of talent that can actually walk into that type of environment and not be able to Google search for a snippet of code, right? It's a different kind of, you have to be a different kind of expert, right? You have to be able to operate independently. So we do have a lot of folks who still operate in those models, but that's not the reality for most. Most folks are out there. The networks are dispersed. The perimeter's gone away, right? It's melted away. It's been replaced by cloud. We've got edge computing. We've got all kinds of things going on. IoT is proliferating across many different use cases, and so you've got this kind of a very fuzzy line between what the enterprise used to be in and where it actually extends to now. And it's really becomes conversation about identity, conversation about data. So it's more of a data-centric, identity-centric conversation. And then the controls that you apply really have to be informed by true risk, understanding of risk, right? And the way to get there is through threat modeling, of course, which, is kind of it sadly is not a common art form, right? People look at it as kind of a thing that, well, yeah, I wish we knew how to do it. And I can't tell you how many folks I've talked to in the last 10 years where they say, well, we wish we had this capability, but we don't. So we basically got to go bottom up, start with tech, and we'll just buy one of everything, whatever says, the latest report from one of the analyst firms, pick one, Forrester, Gartner, et cetera, right? And then we'll just apply it and hope for the best. It's basically throwing spaghetti at the wall, hope it sticks. And when it does, it looks maybe like an abstract painting, but more often than not, it looks like garbage, right? And so we've seen companies and enterprise programs spend tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, hoping that eventually they'll have enough that they'll have enough layers, they'll have enough, they get that defense in depth. It implies a certain rigidity. It implies that a certain level of control over your environment where you can actually create a stack of products. Defense in depth against what, right? There is no castles, there is no moats, there is no defined perimeter. So what are you protecting, right? You have to protect the data, you have to protect the identities, and really knowing what the assets are and what the controls are doing. There's a big push towards, we need to understand our assets. So it's asset identification, mapping out your surface, mapping out your attack surface. In the cloud, it's a little easier, right? Of course, we see the providers actually being a little more upfront with it. Of course, we have a lot of folks out there who are doing the work, to augment those capabilities. It's still very nascent. It's nowhere near where we'd like it to be, right? But at least there is a move towards it. But there's this decisive focus on, let's figure out what we've got so we can protect it. There seems to be an insufficient focus on having the same level of understanding about the controls that you're applying and how efficient and effective they are. And folks tend to think, well, that's just a compliance thing. We just do that. We'll do it once a year. We'll do it once every 6 months, whatever the mandate says. And there's no real understanding of, well, how do you do it continuously? How do I continuously assess and understand where not only my assets are and where my people are and my identities are and where the workflows move and data flows move? That's really important. That's the starting point. That's kind of the foundational table stakes, right? But then when you start applying controls, there's sort of this fire and forget mentality. It's like we'll apply these controls and then we'll wait to see if they're effective. And usually they'll do it through a pen test, or they'll wait for the breach to happen, which unfortunately will happen soon enough, right? So is there a better way? I think there is, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's funny that you kind of landed on pen test as the method of checking for compliance, because that's where my mind was at the entire time, is that, we spend, what is it, every 18 months ballpark that you pay a third party firm or, somebody internally to come and pen test, and are our overall controls actually working the way that we intended? And I kind of mentioned the screen test previously as well, is does that break business, right? And it's one extreme versus the other. It's, am I getting hacked or am I breaking business? And there's no in between as to, there was, if you can't select an individual user, right, and see what they do or do not have access to as far as data shares, even communication efforts, right? It's a little ridiculous in the fact that you can control all the assets you want that are physically plugged into the network, but if you can't control the data, you're just kind of lost in the sauce a little bit. You still have a little fog of war on the map, if you will, if this was a mini map, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think being able to get down to that individual micro level. So, we look at the programs typically from a macro level, a CISO, a CTO, a CRO, right? We tend to think of it as, what's my program doing? And you try to look at statistics, right? Because you're trying to see patterns. You're trying to understand, okay, look, I've got $50 million I got to spend. I can spend, hopefully, right? And there's I feel like there's a bit of a myopic view to a lot of things, again, because security tends to be sort of a segregated function. It's its own function, right? It's got its own budget. CISOs, in my experience, don't necessarily look beyond their own domain. They tend to look at security tools, security technology, security processes, security talents, security people, and they tend to feel like, well, the world's on my shoulders. There's a lot of stress. People don't last in these jobs, right? And they also get fired a lot, right? So the idea that we only have security things to control outcomes, I think it's a little outdated. I think it's also a little myopic. And I get the internal politics. Like, we understand there's organizational politics. You have to show ROI for the investment that you're making as a CISO. And it can be very difficult to do. It's probably one of the most difficult things to do, right? To demonstrate, to quantify what you're getting. We have ROSI, right? Return on security investment. That never took off. People kind of went and looked at it and said, who cares, right? Because it never really made sense, right? So we're trying to exert a level of influence over outcomes with a lot of uncertainty, and also a lot of uncertainty around, well, can we actually demonstrate that we are influencing those outcomes, right? That's the difficult thing, right? So we default to these really weird metrics like, well, let's look at how much money we've spent on a particular type of technology. Let's look at categories of things. Let's look at compliance frameworks and say, okay, well, this is how compliant we are. So that should be a proxy for how secure we are. And of course, we know compliance organizations get breached all the time. That's a mantra that's been kind of a cliche for a long time, right? And everybody always does the same thing. We saw it with the Colonial Pipeline. We got breached, and here's the CEO sitting there in Congress and going, but here's a compliance report from 6 months ago that says we're compliant. And he was very proud to say that we didn't have a bad password. It wasn't password 123, it was something else. Yeah, but you didn't have MFA, so that password was useless anyway, right? So when we look at our programs, I kind of feel like there's a level of focus on just the security things for security people, and we don't look beyond, right? We don't recognize other investments, other maybe tools and technologies, and certainly people assets that could be included in the program that have a security value to them, because we don't have an easy model. Typically, organizations don't have an easy model for understanding their technologies as security controls. There's a big gap, there's a big separation, kind of a chasm, I would say, between risk management, security management, and compliance management, right? They seem to be completely diverged, and there's a concept that I'd love to talk about later on in the conversation, a concept of convergence that I've been promoting, but we can talk about that later. But I think I'm agreeing with you completely. I think there's a level of limitation. I think there's just a limitation in the inherent thinking within the security space. We think about security things. We don't tend to follow the experience model, right? And I think that's what you said, right? Can we get it down to a level of a single user, single process, single workflow, and map that out and understand that from a threat modeling perspective? And there's something else I like to talk about, which is the security experience design. And a lot of people haven't heard that phrase before. That's really the idea of taking what we know about UX, right? User experience and experience design, and really mapping it to security and risk management, and it's not just to the level of, what's the analyst experiencing when they look at a console, right? What is a SOC person experiencing when they look at some SIM platform, right? It's really the security experience of the entire enterprise. How do they experience security? How does security interface with them in their daily lives? Is it a positive experience? Is it a negative experience? Every time we've done an instant poll during one of these conversations, it's 50-50. Some people say they absolutely hate dealing with security and risk, and especially compliance. Everybody hates compliance, right? Kind of like everybody hates insurance, right? Like two of the most hated professions in America are actually auto dealer, used car dealer, and insurance broker. That tells you something, right? So compliance kind of fits in that same story, right? So if we can focus on creating a better compliance, security, risk management experience, and really focus on being able to look at things at that micro level, right? Of course, we can't look at everything, but at least we can capture representative experiences, so we can understand things from that perspective. We can lean into some other conversations about culture change, which is kind of that next level evolution of your traditional user behavior management, right? And traditional awareness training, which has sort of fallen short of our goals. We can evolve towards that, but again, it starts with this having the intent and being very authentic about trying to understand what is that user experience across that entire model.
So Igor, just to jump in there, you're talking about engaging security awareness training programs, and to your point, getting back to when the CEO is very proud of the passwords and this and that, and I think most enterprises try and drive that security awareness among employees, but regardless, users remain the single most frequently exploited point of failure in security incidents. Have we sort of reached peak awareness of this? I mean, it seems like everybody knows, right, at this point, multi-factor authentication, change your password every X number of days, whatever. Have we reached this peak awareness? And if so, what can be done to address this ongoing, persistent, human risk factor?
Great question. I appreciate it, Catherine. So yeah, I think the answer is probably yes. I think if we haven't reached peak awareness, we're probably approaching it pretty quickly. I think there's an inherent limit built into how much you can actually get out of security awareness training, right? Ultimately, we're not talking about behavioral change management. We're talking about organizational change management and really culture change. And so these are the kinds of concepts that, security folks are not really great at, because most security folks are not, they're mostly technologists. They're not behavioral experts. And so when we talk to folks out there who are actually doing that kind of work, what they're saying is, they're reaching kind of the limit of how much change, how much influence they can exert through traditional. And I'm putting big air quotes around traditional because, what does that mean? Basically, typical training, come down, look at a thing 6 months, every 6 months or every 3 months. We're going to show you a video. We're going to maybe have you play a game. We're looking at a lot more gamifying, out there. People are liking gamification. It seems to be a little more engaging. I just went to a conference a couple of days ago, and there's a lot of talk about that in the awareness training community. So we're trying to find ways to get into the mind of the user, the biggest attack surface that we've got. But it's a difficult proposition because, people have their daily jobs, right? Security is not a component of what they do. They don't think about it. And we're trying, as much as we keep talking about it, as much as we keep saying, security is everybody's problem. Security is everyone's responsibility. We've been reluctant, and when I say we, I mean as the industry, we've been reluctant to apply actual accountability, to actually demand accountability in real, tangible ways. Meaning, if you're responsible for a breach or an incident and something you've done was willful negligence, right? Look, honest mistakes are honest mistakes, right? But if you actually unpack and you say, look, you knew you were not supposed to do it, you willfully were negligent, then there should be some kind of a penalty. And I mean, and it can be, like the days of Hammurabi, it can just be, you stole something, you get your hand chopped off, or you built a bad building and we're going to collapse the wall on you as that's the punishment, right? The deterrence model has exhausted itself. That's where I think we're reaching the peak, right? So it's not so much peak awareness. I think it's peak deterrence, right? There's only so much that we can do to deter bad behavior. There has to be a better way to encourage positive behavior in good, positive ways, right? So it is about, ultimately, it boils down to culture change. And if you're willing as an organization to invest in that, I think you can exert the kind of influence you're trying to exert, positive influence, good influence, and really create better outcomes long term, where it's not this adversarial model of security. Always the Department of No, always the Department of Enforcement. They're kind of the internal, they're the cops running around, in the night and trying to get people, catch people doing bad things. And then of course you've got entrapment, right? Where we're doing these phishing tests and we catch people and then we hammer them and say, you got to do more training. It's like, I just did training and apparently I didn't learn anything because I just failed your phishing test. So what gives, right? So it creates this negative feedback loop. I mean, it's a positive feedback loop of negativity. Let's go with that, right?
Yeah.
How do we break out of that? I think is the question. I think it's culture change, right? So investing in culture change, and I know it sounds fuzzy, and I know it sounds hokey, and it's kumbaya, and we're sitting around the fire playing with our tambourines, and security people don't like to talk about that. But you're talking about the human element here, which is the biggest attack surface, and yet we're ignoring it and trying to throw more technology at the problem. So I think that's a failure mode, right? We need to get past it.
So Jack, is it a matter of more training, and is it a matter of better training, more engaging training? What's the answer?
I think that we have two primary issues, and the culture shift is a great example of that. Yes, we need to get away from negative reinforcement, period, because people make mistakes. And the thing is that with negative reinforcement, users are going to try and hide their mistakes, which is just going to exacerbate the problem, because as a security practitioner, I can't fix what I don't know about. And if the user clicks on something, I can't go then fix it quickly. I have to wait for an alert to hit a console, and you might have already given away the keys to the kingdom. So it's a much better, and I think a solution here is to remember, as employees of a company, we exist to best enable business operations. If we are a hindrance to business operations, that's where we're out of a job. So as security, our best bet is to work together, synergy with the employees to make sure that they are safe and secure And if they mess up, we're all in this together. Let's fix it. Let's talk about how to get better about it and then move forward. And it's, that might be just a little bit of the military small unit leadership stuff coming in from my experience, but it's still one of those things where we all have the same objective: better endpoint sales, better, services being provided, better customer experience, whatever it is. The betterment of the business is better for all, right? At least for us as employees. So with that type of mindset from a security and a culture standpoint, we could fix this. I think the other problem too is, well, I guess there's three problems. The other problem is the engagement factor of security training, where it's not just PowerPoints, but actually getting there's so many different ways that people learn and experience and engage. That's why we try and we have slides, we have instructors talking to you, we have, actual labs that you can put your hands on and things like that. It's the same thing in security awareness. Just because a user might not be familiar with bash and scripting and something like that, it's not to say that they can't put their hands on something, to actually mess around with security in some way, shape, or form. So I think that we are checking too much of a box right now with user training, and we need to be a little bit better about what is actually going to get this point across from an education standpoint. And then lastly, even when we do things right, attackers find ways around it. For example, with Cisco Talos recently released a report on how Cisco was breached due to MFA exhaustion. They had MFA set up. They had a complicated password. And the individual basically just kept getting MFA alert after MFA alert at a cyclic rate, to the point to where he finally just said yes. And that, at which point, with everything done right, at which point, did the user who knew what they were doing, they had MFA and they didn't just immediately hit yes, they kept hitting no, at a point of exhaustion of I'm tired of this thing vibrating in my pocket constantly. Let me just hit yes on this once and then talk to security about it. Keys of the kingdom are already gone. They were able to respond pretty quickly to it. But the point being is that we can teach users to not click on stuff all we want, but if the attackers are going to still find ways around it, there's a point where it's what is the what is the at which point is it the attacker's just good, and the user isn't necessarily wrong in this case. You can understand it from a attack frame point where it becomes a social engineering aspect, right? Where they just get one over on you. And it even happens to CEOs. We know BEC is one of the main drivers right now. And those individuals, they're not somebody in accounting or answering a phone or something like that. They're supposed to be the head of the company, really in the know of what is and is not security. And yet they're still the ones getting compromised much more frequently, actually, than you would expect. So I think that it's a combination of culturalism to fix the issue, where we need to be, as well as education, fix the education, and then also, again, work towards a commonality of a goal from an organization standpoint, so that way we have a little empathy towards the people that do actually click on things and stuff like that when necessary, when needed, right?
So I got a good question coming in from Dharmesh Patel watching on YouTube. Dharmesh, thank you for the question. Asking, is there any tool in the market that could help to fill the gap between risk management, compliance, and security management? Any specifically unified tool?
Well, we certainly believe so, and I appreciate the question, Dharmesh. So we are promoting the concept of convergence, and we call it converged continuous compliance. And so we actually built our platform over the last 10 years to do exactly that. And the idea is we're trying to eliminate the gap and really create this convergence model for managing risk, security, and compliance jointly. We view compliance as not, again, we don't want to view compliance as its own domain. Traditionally, it is, right? People do compliance, full stop, then they do security, full stop, then they do risk management. Compliance and risk management really should be considered one unified function. Security is just one of the things that we do in our business. Compliance is how we say that how we demonstrate that we're actually doing it right? Compliance is not just a thing you have to get past. Compliance can actually be very useful, but you have to do it on a continuous basis. And what we found empirically over many years of experience that we've been doing this as a company and as individual practitioners is that really the only difference between true risk management as people think of it and compliance management is timescale. So when you look at compliance, typically you're looking in the rearview mirror. You're always looking backwards, right? You're capturing past state. And that's not particularly useful from a risk management perspective because, well, how can you be expected to make risk-based decisions about protecting your business on data that sometimes goes back to 3 years or more, right? Especially in the federal space, triennial assessments, reassessments, that's the reality. So you're looking at data from 2-3 years ago. I mean, even if it's 2 weeks old, it's probably out of date, right? So from an operational value perspective, it carries very little value. So from security organizations perspective, they don't tend to view compliance as particularly useful. It's a drag. It's a resource constraint. It's something else I have to do. It's another piece of data I have to give to somebody. And when we talk about that experience design aspect, right? When we think about, what is the compliance experience for most folks, it's very negative, right? It's always people asking me for data. It takes forever. It goes into some spreadsheet. It's not particularly alive or useful or dynamic. Extracting insights out of it is very difficult. And by the way, what's the point? We're going to have to come back and do it again next year, right? And it's all just so we can do this report, check the big fat box, somebody signs off on it, off it goes. That's the way compliance has been seen traditionally. And it's been seen that way, frankly, since the days of Hammurabi. I mentioned the Code of Hammurabi. Like, that's our first known written code of compliance, right? It had a building code in it. It was very simple. You build a bad building, and somebody dies, we collapse the building on top of the person who built it, right? Very, very draconian, very barbaric, but it was probably effective. We actually don't know how effective it was, right? But we have building codes now, and they're pretty good, pretty damn effective, right? So
pretty effective.
Yeah, pretty effective. So when we think about kind of that deterrence model of compliance, that's the way things have been built. And really, they barely changed over the last 4,000 years. We're a lot more sophisticated. We're a lot more civilized. We don't flog people in the public square anymore if they do bad things. But ultimately, that's kind of what lies at the core of this, right? But it's always looking at past acts. There's this built inherent limitation of traditional compliance. And so when we asked the question about 10 years ago, well, how would you change it? If you were trying to disrupt that traditional model, really create true security value out of compliance programs, you would have to converge on that time scale. That was the first convergence factor for us. And so if we can do compliance in real time, that was the first realization. The second one was, well, how would you actually implement it? And the answer was, well, you have to go to the real-time data. Where do you get that, right? You can't get it from people. And by the way, there's also the trust factor, right? That's the third portion. And can you really trust opinions? And, well, the answer is really you can't, because they're subjective, right? So when you look again at traditional compliance and audit programs, look, I've been a certified auditor, I've been an assessor, I've done remediation work for large companies who couldn't pass their assessments and audits. And so I'm very familiar with the process. It's a negotiation. And whenever I ask an auditor, do you realize you're always engaged in a negotiation? They go, yeah, we know. That's the reality, right? So there's this inconsistency in a process that's meant to create consistency in your risk management practices, right? These frameworks, these standards, they're built on threat profiles. Take PCI DSS, that's a good example, right? It's based around cardholder data protection. So these controls are meant to wrap around those kinds of threat models. And then you take that across, right? Any other framework is based on those kinds of ideas. NIST 853, lots of smart people at NIST sat around and came up with this. And they asked the industry and they commented on it. So these controls, these frameworks, these standards, these mandates, they represent really good ideas. The only problem is they're inherently bound to this retrospective timescale. So that's what we wanted to disrupt. And so we did. We asked, where is the best source of data? Where's that ground truth? Where's the objective data? Not opinion, right? And what I call traditional compliance management and audit management, it's opinion farming at scale. That's what it is. You're asking a lot of people to give you their opinions, and you do it at micro level of a single control. That's very common. You go to a system owner and you say, hey, tell me about this control. Tell me what it's doing. We're going to capture that. It's going to go into some spreadsheet. Sometimes we're going to write a report about it. We'll publish it, and then it'll go to the auditors, right? And then they'll accept it or not, and they'll challenge you a lot, right? That's that inconsistency again coming in. You'll have a negotiation about it. You'll have a little party, and you'll talk about the controls and mitigation tactics and compensating controls, et cetera, right? And so if you want to really change that model, you have to say, well, where's the actual truth? Where's the trust? How do we get to that? And the answer is you go to data, right? You go to the source of truth and you go to the technical controls, right? Administrative controls are fine, right? We have to capture them. Are you doing awareness training? Yes, we are. Now, can you actually do this in a way that you can create telemetry around that? Can you automate that process? Can you actually do awareness training in an engaging way, like you talked about, Jack, right? So you're actually doing exercises. You're getting people involved. You're getting their hands on something. You put them in some kind of a sandbox or a lab where they can actually play with these things. Can you capture that data? Can you add that to the mix of the telemetry that you're collecting from all the technical resources, like the firewalls and servers and your cloud instances, et cetera, right? So if you can put that together, in that single, the ultimate single pane of glass that we all want, right? Where does the bulk of that data live? Well, it's probably going to mean some kind of a SIM. And of course, SIM has evolved over the years, and you probably want some kind of a big data platform. So for us, that big data platform is Splunk. That's our big partner. We've been partners with them for over a decade. And so we looked at that not so much as, who's the leading provider of that technology. For us, it just made perfect sense because we were looking for the objective ground truth that came from the environment itself, right? If we can eliminate human hands and human interaction with the data across its entire life cycle, right? From the actual control, from the point of collection, all the way to it becoming a pixel on somebody's dashboard that some auditor or board member looks at. We wanted to understand how many hands have touched it and how many folks have applied their opinion to it, right? So how much of that trust has been eroded by the inherent limitations of the traditional compliance models. So that's what we focused on. And that's what we built. So from our perspective, yes, there is a way to do it. It's called converged continuous compliance. And that's what we'd love to talk to you about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot better than the previous policy. So my experience with a lot of compliance and risk is two things. One, it's a package. It's a package you do ahead of time before you set up a network or a circuit or whatever else as far as the controls go. And then I used to use it in an operational method where I would look up what does this package entail, what type of risk controls are applied here, what type of data is it using, and I would evaluate these things. But like you said, it's 8 to 12 months out of date. It might be years out of date depending on when it was set up, and it was this completely independent item that was just done, filed, and there for whenever the auditor comes through, and it does complicate things. I mean, I used to use a reasoning for reimages when it came to systems that I found in an incident that, compliance had been invalidated, need to reimage and set back to the compliant state because of the breach, or the compromise, whichever you want to say, on a particular system. And it's a good reasoning, right? Because it's technically true. You can't trust that system anymore once it's been compromised. But realistically, what does that mean? For us, it just meant a baseline. Like a compliance model was the baseline of the image or the server or the device or whatever else. And then you look at it from a network perspective. If you're talking about, network segmentation and the way that things are communicating, how does that architecture look? Is it compliant, right? And it just seemed to become, from an operational standpoint, a catch-all for what is expected and is it there, right? And real time, I think, would be amazing. I mean, I can't tell you how many hours I've spent checking logs just to make sure things are or are not compliant. I mean, even, you have the new hotness vulnerability that just comes out, and I have to check compliance data. Is this or is this not affected, or something else like that? Is it using this particular model software, even though it's not on our approved list? Things like that because of compliance, or however micro or macro you want to go. So I think real-time data, being able to both engage with it from a compliance standard and then also operational standard, super powerful.
So I want to jump in and remind everyone that we are conducting this live poll right now because a lot of this poll relates to exactly what we're talking about. Head over to info.ine.com/GRC. It's right at the top of your screen. For most of the stream, take part in the poll. You can drop in your answers. Also register to see the results, get insights into industry trends as it relates to exactly what we're talking about here today. I want to get to another question. This is Janet Manning watching on LinkedIn today. Janet, thank you for the question. She asked, what is the best way to combine risk, compliance, IT, and cybersecurity?
Great question. Thank you for that, Janet. So we feel that, again, convergence, it has to start as a conversation at a very high level, right? If you try to do this as a bottom-up exercise and you basically try to look at it as, what tool do we buy, what platform do we enable, et cetera, it can be very difficult to bring that in, right? So you really do have to look at things as an organizational change leadership conversation. So you have to talk to the leaders about that, right? Grassroots change does not happen. I mean, you can have a revolution or you can have a mutiny, but that's very rare. And of course, in organizations, it doesn't really work. So you really have to talk to the CISOs and the CTOs, CROs, chief risk officers, chief compliance officers, legal department, right? Folks who tend to be involved in the compliance lifecycle on a daily basis, or either deal with it because that's their job, or deal with it because they're forced to deal with it because of the realities of compliance management. And so, when you talk to the stakeholders, you can bring them into the room and you can explain the value of converging on at least a portion of their function and really help them understand that the pivot point is really data. And you ask some basic questions, very high level questions. These are questions I like to ask when I do my discovery sessions with leadership of our client and prospect organizations is, how much trust do you have in your program, right? And we see Forrester is coming out right now with this new model called Trust Imperative. There's a lot of focus on trust. And so when you think about trust as a component of your corporate brand, we're not just talking about reputational risk from a pure brand management perspective, but we're talking about trust as an integral component of who you are as a company. And security goes into that, compliance goes into that, risk management goes into that, and your supply chain risk goes into that. So really, risk and trust become very synonymous. And when you think about kind of the externally facing importance of risk, and trust, right? It affects your ability. I mean, it really eventually does boil down to the impact on your P&L, right? Are you able to find suppliers that are willing to work with you? Are you willing to find customers that are willing to buy from you? Are you able to find partners that are willing to work for you? Because right now we're getting into a regulatory climate where we're seeing a lot of enforcement from FTC, from the SEC. If you're a public company, that's something to be concerned about. We're seeing mandates coming out of the White House, M2131 OMB memorandum. We've got Executive Order 14028. We've got CMMC 2.0 if you're in defense industrial base. And I can go on and on and on, right? So there's all of these new mandates that are coming out, and all of them, if you kind of were to analyze them at a very high level, they're asking for transparency, they're demanding accountability, and we just saw, for the first time ever, a personal consent decree being applied to an individual, not a company. And this happened with a former CEO of a company called Drizzly, which was an alcohol delivery company here in the US, and they were acquired by Uber. The CEO long left, right? This breach happened about 18 months ago. But so a breach happened during his tenure. He left the company after the acquisition. FTC has come down on the company with a set of fines and demands for them to create a better security program. Well, so now the CEO is carrying actually a personal consent decree. Anywhere he goes from this point forward, he has to actually abide by FTC rules and regulations when it comes to creating a good security program, and he has tremendous oversight. So he's going to be living under that consent decree for the foreseeable future, probably I think over in the next 5 years, if my memory serves. So this is the level of scrutiny we're getting to. So as a company and as a leader, you have to think about, what does that do if you have a breach? What does it do if you can? I mean, look, everybody gets breached, right? Jack talked about that. It's an eventuality. It's not. The chance is virtually 100% that you'll get breached at some point. But what you can do to actually demonstrate you actually had a functional program, that you've done the due diligence, you've done the right thing, that you were credibly responsible and accountable to your organization and to your customers and to your regulators, for building a good security program. That's the big question. And how do you answer that question, right? And you have to answer it, in my view, by building a coalition of partners within your organization that can understand the value of that convergence, right? If you can stop treating risk as somebody else's problem, you actually understand it from an organization-wide standpoint, and you say everybody has a hand in this, everybody certainly has a role to play in this, kind of like we do with security, right? We just elevate that a layer higher, right? We're starting to talk about risk, and then the next layer is trust. So when you think about trust, and what that means within the company, what it means outside the company, and the trust that people have in your brand, when you think about, when your name comes up, what do they think about, right? And how it affects your outcomes as an organization, as an enterprise, as a business. So that's sort of how you start the conversation. And then you get people to understand, look, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of the same data that we use. So the convergence model is really, it's a no-brainer. It's a natural next evolutionary step in a better, more effective, more efficient program that doesn't have the separation of powers, that actually is working on a more of a collaborative basis. And there are obviously technologies that, technologies that we're bringing to market that allow people to do that. But we don't start the conversation with technology, right? It's not a conversation about buy our platform, buy our technology, believe in what we do. It's really about the belief system, right? If you believe that convergence is the next evolutionary step, and we believe that it is, if you believe that these functions can truly help each other and really work more collaboratively, not separately, then we've got something we can talk to you about. But yeah, that's our approach. That's the way we think about that.
So Jack, then, and that's very interesting, Igor. Where do you think cyber insurance fits into this conversation?
Well, I think right now we have too much reliance on it. I think that too many businesses are using it not just as it's designed to be the gap for whenever the breach does happen, but they are leaving too much risk to be transferred into the cyber insurance realm. The problem that you run into there is like once the data's gone, the data's gone. The effects are felt, and while the company may be able to pay out so much money or clean it up or anything else like that, your consumers are then faced with the risk of their data having been breached now transfers over into possibly identity theft or account takeover later on down the road. And I think that it's become, unfortunately, so commonplace for a company to get breached and so many people to have lost data that you're not seeing the same reputation hits as you used to do. So with that, they pay into, and I say they, I mean companies pay into this, fund, basically this slush fund of, oh no, if this does happen one day, we'll at least be covered. And the problem is that you see sometimes a lack of technical controls as an outset, like, oh, don't worry, insurance has it. Whereas you should look at cyber operations on a day-to-day basis, as in checking your blind spots when you're driving, putting on your seatbelt and your 10s and 2s and everything else like that, from operating on a, genuinely safe mantra of safe driving. Whereas your cyber insurance should be just like the insurance on your vehicle. You shouldn't touch it unless you have a catastrophic incident, and your airbags you can even look at as your glass break situation for your accounts and stuff like that. Like, you should not touch these things unless you are having a catastrophic incident to where you might face bankruptcy or some form of significant hindrance to the business. Could to the point of being crippling. Realistically, we've had some individuals that have had a business that went under as a result of a cyber attack. So it's one of those things where I think that we are looking too much as, oh, don't, driving around with our seatbelt off going, oh, don't worry, I've got insurance.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting analogy. Yeah, I can't agree more. I think a lot of folks have also come to an unpleasant realization, kind of a surprising realization of the limitations of their insurance coverage. And, we saw that with all the ransomware attacks over the last couple of years, especially the huge peak during the pandemic. Everybody went home. All the enterprise controls kind of faded away because, well, they weren't there and the people weren't within the enterprise anymore. So you're sitting at home, you're getting hit, you don't have a lot of resources. You don't even have somebody to turn to and go, does this look a phishing link to you or does it not, right? So people kind of were left on their own, hoping that we can push out these controls to the endpoints. And that wasn't very effective, right? We didn't send them out there with a lot of tools. And we also didn't send them out with a lot of knowledge because it was only as good as the last security awareness training that they had, and that was probably 6 months ago, or maybe a year ago, right? So when the pandemic hit. So we've had this huge peak of ransomware, and then turns out these insurance policies weren't really covering it. They were barely covering the remediation costs for maybe like an offshore firm. It was certainly not a tier 1 firm, not like a Mandiant, right? And so when you realize, okay, well, I've got, I had this policy. Well, what was the coverage? Well, it turns out you didn't read the actual policy itself. And then there's the next level, right, where some of these attacks were actually classified as nation-state acts. And acts of war are typically excluded under traditional policies. And so that's exactly what AXA of France did about a year and a half ago, I believe, where they basically said, we got to deny this coverage. And I think that case is actually being resolved right now. I'm about to read some news about it. But yeah, so there was this massive lawsuit. We're talking about billions, right, where they basically denied coverage. They said, no, this was an act of war. And what was interesting about it, they unilaterally declared something to be a nation state act, which typically involves some kind of a State Department or Foreign Services, department of something like that. It has to be official. It has to be by an actual nation state. But they took a unilateral action as a private company and said, well, we don't think we're going to cover it. And they had to get fought on that in court. So I think it's resolving actually in the plaintiff's favor. I think the insureds are actually getting coverage in the end, but don't quote me on that just yet. So insurance is not a catch-all. That's the other thing. There's the other thing that people actually use is the risk register. And I've seen that time and again. We don't know what to do with this thing. We don't have mitigating controls. We can't even figure out how expensive it's going to be. We know it's going to be expensive. So we'll just pretend that we are a nuclear company and we're going to self-insure because really there's nobody who can write insurance for something like that. So we'll just go ahead and carry it on the books and we'll create a risk acceptance letter and we'll just what they call RAL it. We'll just RAL it and they'll be fine, right? So just because you're not thinking about it didn't mean it went away. You're still carrying that risk on the books. It remains unaddressed, unmitigated, and that's problematic. So when you think about also what the insurance companies are doing, they want to know a little more, or actually a lot more, about what the control state is of as they do their underwriting, right? They want that transparency. So the thing we talked about before, the regulatory transparency, the need of regulators to understand exactly what you're doing in your program, not just get a one sheet of paper at the end of the year that says we're compliant, right? They want to know on a continuous basis. That's really hard, right? So insurance companies actually want that same thing. They want to understand what your control stack is doing, how effective it is. And they don't want to report from 6 years ago or 2 months ago. They want it now. So I think in terms of even being able to become an underwritable risk in this new environment, a lot of companies are going to face a lot of difficulty getting coverage at the level that they want. They might be able to get coverage to cover them for the response services, but in terms of actually covering risk of loss from a cyber incident, very difficult. And so I think getting to a point where your compliance program and your security program can answer these questions on an ongoing, continuous basis. Kind of, like, wake me up at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday and tell me where your program is right now. Right, it's kind of that classic commercial from the 80s. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your kids are? Right, it's whatever p.m. Right? Do you know where your controls are? Can you answer that question? I think a lot of folks basically would just default to pulling out their compliance report, which is only as good as the data that's in it. And by the way, that data is already old. Right. So I think that's a challenge for most.
It's funny, going back to my metaphor previously about the vehicle, when you're talking about compliance and reporting and stuff like that, like on the road, there are compliance standards as well. And you'll get heads up whenever you're out of compliance standards with that little light we like to ignore on our dashboard. It'll say like, hey, the engine's in trouble right now, or you're running out of gas or whatever else. So that is a real-time feedback of your current compliance on your vehicle with some things, and then you have to do regular checks for oil and tires. And so this is the same type of thing. If you think about the operations of just going down the road, this would be the type of feedback that you're regularly receiving on, is my tire blown out? Is my air pressure okay? Is my oil, does my oil need to be changed? Have I hit the mileage markers or whatever else? It's just necessary to safely operate the vehicle, to actually do the operation. So you just kind of doubled back down on that. But when it comes to the risk, and I talked to a friend of mine about 6 years ago, whenever cyber insurance was really starting to kick up, and he worked in insurance, and he legitimately told me, like, we're just kind of accepting stuff if they're willing to pay us. Like, we're not even sure exactly where the policies are, but that was 6 years ago. Nowadays, they've got people in there who know exactly how to write out these policies to make sure that they're not covered, getting hung up on 7-figure, 8-figure payouts and everything else like that for something that is just being glossed over from a control standpoint too. Right?
Absolutely. And the funny thing is the underwriting process back in those days basically involved looking to see how many questions in a questionnaire somebody could get through. If they could get through about half, like, all right, maybe we'll write this risk. And again, the exclusions would always apply. So people were just so happy to get insurance, and the insurance companies are very happy to cash that check, right? Get that premium, knowing full well that the things were so fuzzy and remained so fuzzy for a long time that they could really wiggle out of covering anything past just the basic level of response, right? We'll get you, some version of Mandiant to come in and do kind of a once over and hopefully try to get you back to operations. But ultimately, they were not on the hook for much beyond that. So they'll pay $1 million, $1.5 million. Somebody will come in, do forensics, bring in law enforcement, and then you'll do a case, and then maybe you'll recover, maybe not, typically not. And that's about it, right? They weren't actually on the hook for any business losses, in the tens of millions or billions, right? And that's what most people misunderstood. And now, of course, as you pointed out, right, it's getting a lot more sophisticated, and they want that transparency. And by the way, if you try to sneak past them, right, and even if you do hoodwink an underwriter, when it comes time to claims, they will find out, right? They will unravel. It's kind of like saying, I'm not a tobacco user, and then turns out you smoke a pack a day, right? And then, he died, now his wife goes to collect, and it's like, well, yeah, but, the blood test showed that he's been a smoker for the last 25 years. We're not covering that, right? So you can try to get past that hurdle, but the reality is you can't, right? They demand that transparency. And if your program is incapable of demonstrating that on an ongoing basis, kind of like you talked about, right? The car dashboard, right? If you can't show that dashboard with a very clear message, it's green across the board, or maybe, hey, we don't have to be green all the way, right? But as long as you're honest about it, as long as there's credibility in it, that's fine, right? At least we know where we stand versus, well, we kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping that it sticks, right? Controls have to be answered for. Investments have to be answered for. If you can understand it through a perspective of compliance, if you do it right, if you do it right, if you do it in real time, continuous monitoring, absolutely important, right? If you don't know where you stand at any given time, guess what? Your attackers do. Right, so they're not looking at the check boxes you checked 3 years ago, or 3 months ago, or 3 minutes ago. Right, hackers don't care about check boxes. That's a mantra to live by. Right, they're not impressed by your compliance reports. So stop living by the report. Stop living by the cyclical model. Go to the continuous model. Converge on risk, converge on compliance, converge on security. It's the same data. There is no security data, compliance data, risk data. It's all data. Right, as long as you know that, that's a starting point. Right, so.
Fully agree. Fully agree.
Igor and Jack, I think we could talk about this all day because the bottom line is this is complicated, this is challenging, it is affect almost every single enterprise out there, right? And it is not going away. We are going to wrap it up right now, but just want to thank you guys both for joining us. I think great conversation, some jumping off points where we can follow up on this and maybe bring you back for a stream, Igor. We'd love to do that because a lot of questions and again. I just think this is around to stay, right? So thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
All right, that is going to wrap up today's stream. Thank you for watching. If you missed it live, look for the replay across our social channels as well as on the INE website. A quick reminder, I mentioned this earlier, we are conducting a live poll right now. You can head over to info.ine.com/GRC right there on your screen to take part in the poll. You can just drop your answers in, also register to see the results and get insight into industry trends as it relates to GRC. All the things we were talking about today and more. Be sure to like and subscribe on the social media platform you're using right now so that you can stay in the loop for details on all our streams and get notifications when we do go live. We'll see you next time. Until then, have a great week.